Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod and the final installment of Black Redcoats. We return with the story of the Corps of Colonial Marines, 1814 to 16. I am flying solo in the hot seat, but it's okay because I've got Matt Taylor, who more than makes up for any kind of absence of your favorite co-host, whether it be Liam, Luke, or Josh. Matt, if you don't remember already, is a British civil servant working in the UK's House of Lords and is the author of Black Redcoats, the Corps of Colonial Marines, 1814 to 16, which you can buy from Pen and Sword. Please go direct to the vendor. The link is in the description. Matt, welcome back. Lovely to see you. How you doing, mate?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Zach. It's good to see you again.
Was the last time we spoke at Leeds?
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah. When I was just in the crowd.
It was an odd experience to not sort of see you resplendent in your usual sort of House of Lords style gear. So for folks who aren't familiar, Matt fundamentally has two looks. One is sort of guy in the crowd at a rock concert, and the other is somebody who stepped off the set of Bridgerton. And there are two looks that he rocks very well, it has to be said. But yes, it was unusual to see you in your rock star look because I've become accustomed to seeing you in your Bridgerton era, as it were. Okay, to business. We talked last time out about the establishment of the Colonial Marines, the training. We talked about the folks who led them. And we kept sort of flirting with the idea of talking about their combat service whilst not getting there. That might have been my fault. But we're going to do what we actually threatened to do. We're going to actually talk about their combat service. We covered the skirmish of Rumley's Gut in episode 1. Can you therefore talk us through their wider combat experience throughout the campaign in the Chesapeake?
Yes, certainly. Well, after the Colonial Marines are formed in May 1814, they have what I can only describe as an incredibly busy couple of months from June to August 1814, where the unit is simultaneously seemingly expanding almost daily in numbers of enlisted men, while also almost continually in service. So after their initial skirmish at Rumley's Gut on the Pungo Teague, which was their first live fire experience and included the entire set of the first volunteers to the unit. Then their next identifiable action is the Battle of Cedar Point, which was one of the many operations against the quite famous Commodore Barney's little gunboat flotilla, which was the only kind of meaningful U.S. naval resistance to the British in the Chesapeake. It was a very brave set of men in little ships, and they continually annoyed the expeditionary force essentially by surviving, but were pretty much continually bottled up in various rivers and things like that. So they didn't really get the opportunity to launch offensive operations, but we had to continually contain them, and we never managed to completely destroy them, which was something the Americans have held on to pretty strong in the narrative of this war. But there's also very interesting arguments about they were a leftover President Jefferson era policy of the US Navy doesn't need big ships, it only needs little ships to defend the coast. And this kind of demonstrates how meaningless that is when a full naval warship turns up. But at Cedar Point, where the Colonial Marines appeared in Cedar Point is hard to pin down. I suspect they were involved simultaneously in some landing operations which were designed to outflank the gunboat flotilla on land, because the gunboat flotilla also had support from US militia and some US regulars, a rare appearance of US Army regulars in this theatre. And also were likely on board British barges and small ships which went up and down after Barney's flotilla. The strongest line we've got about them is in a report by one of the Royal Navy captains to Admiral Coburn, Coburn being responsible for the unit being set up recently, he reports back to Coburn, I'm very impressed by the Colonial Marines. They exhibited a continual eagerness to get to grips with their former masters, which is a very, again, it's quite a classic kind of reserved Napoleonic statement about what sounds like a unit champing at the bit to get into action. After Cedar Point, we then move to an incredibly intriguing and amazingly quite funny skirmish at a place called Chesconnix Creek. A Virginia militia commander came aboard, I think, HMS Tonnant under flag of truce, part of the many interactions between British and Americans in this theatre, because everyone speaks English essentially. And in an unusual situation, this Virginia militia commander lost his temper while talking to Lieutenant Scott, who was Admiral Coburn's aide-de-camp, and essentially said something along the lines of you lot are pretty good at sneaking around at night setting fire to stuff, but if you come and have a go at me, we'll blow you to hell. Which must have been a great kind of like tense moment under that flag of truce. But Lieutenant Scott, he rose to this challenge, got permission from Admiral Coburn to, well, let's go and have a go then. This guy runs a little fortification at Chesconnix Creek. Let's go and see if he's as tough as he says. And in order to launch that attack, they attempt reconnaissance of the site, and they get what Lieutenant Scott calls in his memoir a Turkish welcome, which means they're essentially fired at as they approached. So they couldn't get good reconnaissance that way. So what did they do? They went to the Colonial Marines and the wider black refugees. And amongst the Colonial Marines, there's a guy who used to be enslaved by the very militia commander, and he knows this post quite intimately in a way which suggests he either worked there on behalf of the militia commander, maybe took part even in the building of it. Lots of things in this area, military stuff in particular, made use of enslaved labour. And this meant that Lieutenant Scott was able to launch a night raid on the fortification, guided in the lead boat by a man formerly enslaved by this fortification's commander. And the enslaved man kind of went beyond his brief a little bit. Lieutenant Scott seems to suggest in his book that, I would have preferred to land a little bit behind the fort, so to speak, sneak past it and we can cut it off. But the enslaved man, he brought us right up to the fort. We were literally under the guns of the fort in the dark. And the Colonial Marines, Royal Marines, some sailors, Lieutenant Scott, took the opportunity. They assaulted the fort. The fort got off a single cannon shot, which went ineffectually out to sea because they were already on them. And the garrison of the fort fled so fast that Scott makes an amusing observation that he had one opportunity to line up everybody to do a volley, and it was essentially into the forest outside the fort because they were already all gone. And then perhaps most genuinely funnily, but also in terms of the darker aspects of this tale, because we have to deal with slavery. The garrison commander, the Virginia militia commander, flees in his sleeping clothes, which means that Lieutenant Scott and his men capture his uniform and his hat and his sword, which they take away. And Lieutenant Scott gifts the man's coat to one of the Colonial Marines NCOs. And Lieutenant Scott very laconically in his book later says that via various intermediaries he discovered that the American militia commander was incredibly incandescently angry that his personal property was now in the hands of N-words. And Lieutenant Scott notes kind of jokingly that in at least one written letter he saw, the term "goddamned" was like asterisked out, but that the N word was just written in full. Well, and then Lieutenant Scott laconically notes, you'd think he'd be more upset that we took his fortification out from under him, but that's the nature of the people we're fighting. So that's a really great example of what they bring to us, like the direct granular intelligence of individuals and individual positions, which massively increases our combat power. After the raid and chess comics, there's tons of little ones. So I'm gonna literally have to skip through a bunch. Like from July 1814, a number of the Colonial Marines under Captain Newers are basically in continual action for weeks on end. At one point, Captain Newers notes that bad weather stops their raids more than enemy resistance, which is a great, again, you can really feel the control the British forces feel they're exerting on the area. The granular intelligence aspect that comes up again during one raid. The only resistance suffered was 2 Americans on horseback rode up to a town that the Brits were actually already in, realized the Brits were there, and they took some shots at British officers and rode off, to get away. But there was enslaved people now liberated in the town, and they said, "Oh, we know those 2 guys, we know where they live," and they guided a British force to the house. The 2 gentlemen were taken prisoner of war by British forces and most likely sent to Jamaica, where we kept a camp for American prisoners. And the 2 men's either mother or sister, it's unclear, mother or sister successfully convinced Lieutenant Scott again not to burn their house down. Down. Again, that kind of granular. All the information is so deeply personal and deeply live information. Really benefits everyone. Similarly, there was an attack on a town called Prince Frederick Town, and this is an intriguing one because there's a Colonial Marine called Frisbee who I think was in First Company, and in some of the American reports of this attack, Frisbee is referred to as an officer. He's seen pointing Brits in various directions, essentially giving commands and seemingly in charge. And Frisbee was definitely enslaved by a local of this town. So again, his granular knowledge means that he's the man who knows where things are and what's going on. So when we're setting fire, again, we have a general habit of setting fire to things where resistance is faced, or if it's a public building. So we burn down the courthouse and we destroy the jail. Intriguingly, the jail at Prince Frederick Town contained a single black person. It's unclear if they were enslaved, but they probably were, who was in the jail because he'd been caught attempting to flee to British forces. Which again shows the kind of how kind of the social structure is coming apart. And I suppose the final kind of minor action, so to speak. Again, this is all kind of this is very kind of cool, elite force, special forces kind of stuff. Only dozens or hundreds of men at most. There's an attack on a town called Nomini Ferry, and that attack, again, it's one of these things where it just suddenly pops out of the reports in such a casual way. They think, "Oh, is this what they were always doing?" The attack on Nomini Ferry, it explicitly is not only to raid the town and gain supplies, cause damage American morale, and so on, but it is explicitly stated that they want to hold that town for at least a day to induce enslaved people and provide a route out. And sailors and Colonial Marines seemingly are sent in penny packets on little dagger moves out into the surrounding area. Again, in a way which suggests that those were probably intelligence-led moves by Colonial Marines to farms and plantations where they knew people who were enslaved. That attack on Nomini Ferry was successful because it brought back 135 enslaved people. And at this time, Captain Newers makes he writes in one of his reports where I think was a kind of preparatory line where he says it's essential that we take women and children, otherwise none of the men would come with us. And I think in a way that was kind of him preparing for why are you filling your ships up with so many refugees? If someone came at him that way, if you see what I mean. he also again gives a feel for how many people are fleeing to British forces. Where he says in one letter, the refugees increase so fast that I am becoming somewhat puzzled about what to do with them. And then there's as a kind of like historical observation, which I think is quite funny. A guy called John Stiles, who was an enslaved butler in the household of a well-off local man, and was incredibly valuable for all his skills. As a high level butler, he ends up as Captain Nose's Batman. Batman is observed carrying Nose. Again, intriguing. He's carrying Nose's like personal equipment, like his telescope and things like this. But also in one American report, with again that kind of panicked immediacy, he's also observed carrying Captain Nose's weapons for him when Nose is doing other things. He's going, "I'll take that, sir," if you see what I mean. Which again, it seems quite shocking that you would allow that. So yeah, that kind of small unit actions, clearly very very granular intelligence led, and again, I feel safe saying the vast majority of the time overtly focused not just on burning American property, bringing political pressure, but also British strategy at this point. I kind of fully realised that actually the best way to undermine American resolve in this area is continuous liberation of enslaved people. And I may have mentioned this before, but this reaches the apex where a Virginia militia commander called Hungerford writes a letter. A letter to Washington D.C. basically begging for more federal troops, because it is impossible to call out militia now, because everyone's staying at home, like kind of watching their own enslaved people, so they're unwilling to come out and fight, and the enslaved people themselves are the line he uses is a very kind of nicely poetic one of like, they leave us as spies and return as incendiaries. He also makes, as I mentioned, probably I think I know one of the previous episodes, he's also one of the chief sources for the interesting observation that the intelligence about local terrain and movement by enslaved people gives British forces the edge over local white Americans. White Americans are being ambushed in their own forests.
Let's move it on to the Battle of Bladensburg, August 1814. This is a story that really struck me. So it's one of those moments where I'm just going to stand back, hand the mic to you, and let you do your ever so poetic thing.
In the road to Bladensburg, the British force in the Chesapeake receives some reinforcements from Europe. There was grandiose dreams of getting over 10,000 men released from war in Europe, but instead the British force only received 2,500, which probably tops out all available troops and sailors and Marines who could land and fight are about 5,000 in the whole Chesapeake at max. The British Eye regiments who arrive are the 85th, who are all light infantry, the 21st, 44th, and 44th East Essex, and I think it's the 4th at the time, still the North Britain Fusiliers, but later to be the Scottish Fusiliers.
I feel we're obliged to just sort of cheer the 44th because
For
Liam isn't here, but huzzah for the 44th. There we go, Liam.
But despite this relatively small force, and under the famous Ross, when Ross, who hasn't been in the Chesapeake until this point, when he arrives, he's initially cautious. He's like, actually, we've only got a small force, but the enthusiasm of Cochrane and Cockburn pulls him round to actually, your troops are exactly what we need to do something crazy audacious, something really big, and that is, let's destroy Washington DC, which has been floating around in the letters, particularly between Cockburn and Cochrane, more or less this whole time, because various towns in Canada have been destroyed by the Americans, particularly York, which I think is now Toronto. So the idea of destroying a major American town, and one with such symbolic value as the capital of this republic, it's just been lurking at the back of their minds the whole time. And Ross's skepticism about this operation is overcome by Cockburn, who who I'm not 100% sure, but I definitely feel by putting together things he says in other letters with the sudden switch around in the British plan, Coburn was utterly convinced that we completely pacified the countryside all around around the region due to the fear of slave uprising, and that meant that he felt we could make an audacious landing in Maryland. So not a naval assault on the city up the Potomac, but much further away, about 30 odd miles away. In the end, we landed at the town of Benedict, and he felt, yeah, we could march 30 miles into enemy territory away from our overwhelming naval support, which is our greatest asset, and will likely be able to destroy their capital city. And that takes a level of confidence which I think can at the time could only be explained by we're not going to meet random farmers behind every hedge here. We've locked this area down. They're going to have to do something special to stop us. So the British force does that. It forms up and lands at Benedict in Maryland. The army is organized into, I think, 3 or 4 divisions. The light division is the one we're going to focus on. The 85th, who are all light infantry, form the core of that. They are backed up by the light companies of all the other regiments. So this is our scout skirmish formation. And then about 100 or so possibly as many as 200 Colonial Marines are then appended to this unit as well. Well, separate from the Royal Marines, which again demonstrates demonstrates both the unit's enthusiasm, but also British belief in their local knowledge and their skills as people who know this region. So we stick them in the scout skirmish area of the force, and that's doubly important because we have no cavalry really. This is we haven't brought horses all the way across the Atlantic with us. We've only got a small number of horses for messengers and officers. So the light division is the eyes and ears of the advance. The fact that Colonial Marines are just put straight in there, I think says volumes about well, these are the guys who are they're gonna blow these ambushes. They're gonna tell us which paths are the right paths and so on. So the army then advances towards Washington DC, and it would be fair to say that we were lucky in that the American officer put in charge of the defense of Washington DC was useless. It was a guy called General Winder. His previous contributions to the American war effort had been getting captured in the Battle of Stony Creek in Canada, and then being returned as part of a prisoner swap. And Winder ended up in charge of the defense of Washington DC, more or less because his dad was governor of Maryland, and President Madison thought by giving this bloke a top military job in the area, the governor of Maryland, who was from the opposite political faction and slightly more anti-war, would come around to the president's side. Because what could possibly go wrong putting a man in charge of the defense of our capital when we're so unthreatened? Winder was not up to this task. The army he was able to put together was already undermined by the pacification of the countryside. It depends which sources you read, but theoretically, he should have had 30,000 or 50,000 men from the region. Should have all just rose up, grabbed their guns from their closets, and headed out to defeat the Redcoats all over again, like their dads did. And basically, no one shows up. Shows up, and that's the first indication that something's very wrong in this region. But Winder himself, he can't figure out how he wants to defend Washington DC. He marches the army back and forth in a way that, to my cynical view, I think appears calculated to make it look like he's being thrusting and aggressive, while actually continually giving the opportunity to avoid contact. As something that's facilitated by the fact that we don't have cavalry. So at various times he gets quite close to us and then pulls away with no real shots being exchanged. Eventually, though, he's essentially, in my opinion, forced to stand and fight, because he eventually pulls back towards the town of Bladensburg, and Bladensburg isn't very far from Washington DC. It's pretty much a suburb of the city now, and then a roster of senior government officials, including the president and the secretary of state and all these people, are all just there. there, wanting to see what's going on with defending the capital from this invading force, more or less forcing him to make a stand because he can't pull back now because the president's here. There's a very kind of very fun jokey anecdote that the initial American defense at Bladensburg was on a hill, kind of overlooking all the approaches to the town and its crucial bridge. And for whatever reason, Winder ordered that quite commanding position to be abandoned and for the army to move across the river and the bridge, but leaving the bridge intact, despite the fact that that's what we need to get to Washington, D.C. And when the president arrives, he recognizes the hill on the opposite side of the river is, of course, the correct tactical point to defend from. So he starts riding towards it, and like forward American pickets have to be go, oh, no, you can't go that way, Mr. President, because the British are there. Which again, I mean, there's a fun alternate history idea there where President Madison walks into the British Army. But anyway, so the British Army is stretched out, and the army's been badly hurt by the fact it is a blazing hot summer, and these men have spent weeks at sea. The vast majority of the British Army have spent weeks at sea. That's what's giving us a hard time is the heat more than resistance. So the army's quite strung out, quite over it. But when the Light Division arrives at Bladensburg, he takes some stick for this, but Thornton, who is the 85th commander, he looks at the American disposition, which is they haven't destroyed the bridge, and they have split themselves into 3 defensive lines, which are mutually unsupporting, and have split their artillery, which is significantly better than ours in number, over these lines. So they don't, at any particular point, they don't have overwhelming force. He sees that, and in my opinion and other people's opinions, he says that if we hang around and let the army form up, they'll realize their mistake, mass up, and it'll be a much harder battle. So we've got to go now. So the Light Division, which includes the Colonial Marines, launches itself almost without support across the bridge at Bladensburg, takes relatively heavy casualties, to be fair. But again, the enemy defense is so kind of strung out and split up. It would have been a lot worse if anyone had time to react to our presence. The Light Division pushes across the river, destroy and knocking back the first American line quite easy, which then falls back into the second, creating confusion in the first instance. But the second defensive line includes Commodore Barney and many of his sailors and Marines who dismounted their guns from their ships and came inland. And they're pretty much the only like really hard unit in the American force here. That unit puts up a spirited defense, which is rightly lauded. But the Light Division isn't. The rest of the army is now catching up with the division, and more troops are feeding in. The Light Division moves sideways through good cover in an orchard, and this is where kind of like the classic history storytelling and myth making all happens. There's various arguments that when the Light Division clears the orchard and hits the American flank, so not Commodore Barney's professionals, but just a rando set of militia, they crack instantly. They fold instantly. And depending on who you ask, they fold because they're scared of Congreve rockets. They fold because, they're happy to stand in a field and fire guns, but they're not really into a bayonet fight, if you know what I mean. And of course, then the other one is that which is kind of like a British exceptionalist one, is that, these are British professional soldiers. They're a tougher breed of men, that kind of like line. And the enemy and the Americans unzip, and only Barney's men are left to eventually be surrounded and surrender. But at the moment, though, when the British forces contact the American line, I argue, and will argue forever, that I think the presence of the Colonial Marines in that force which comes out of good cover at close range, bayonets fixed, into the American line, is actually a key contributing morale-shattering factor. Because the entire region has been pacified by fear of a slave uprising, and here in front of you are former American slaves, and they're dressed British, they're dressed in redcoats, and they're coming to fight. It's the nightmare scenario, the eternal horror scenario of the slave society is a slave uprising, and now we've got enslaved people rising up against us who are being armed by foreign enemy. Anyway, I think that had a much greater morale effect than is commonly regarded in the histories of Bladensburg. And I have a very strong set of sources for this, because in the immediate aftermath of the War of 1812, when some of the American officers involved in Bladensburg were explaining what went wrong, a number of them say that the Bladensburg force, as it massed, was riven by a rumor that a widespread slave rebellion had already burst out in Washington, D.C. or Alexandria back behind them. So why are we here in this field? We all need to get back. There's also a Virginian politician who was like a militia commander. He was a politician later in life, but he was a militia commander at this point in Virginia. Later in life, his non-attendance of the Battle of Bladensburg is criticised as part of political campaigning, and he says, "I couldn't go to Bladensburg because I had to call up the militia because there was what turned out to be an untrue rumor of a slave uprising, and I was wandering around trying to find that." And then perhaps in the most kind of delightfully personal, kind of catty one American officer explicitly names another American officer as basically going around kind of throwing out hypotheticals like, wouldn't it be terrible if a slave rebellion kicked off right now? Because we're all here. We're not at home defending our homes. And he more or less says that immediately infected the ranks. So the army, whose numbers are already small because lots of men haven't turned up for fear of a slave uprising, is itself wondering, are we just in the information vacuum? Because this is not an era of instant communications or even like reasonably timed communications. They're just in a field somewhere in Maryland. Anything could be happening. And so then when you've got the Colonial Marines, again, there's everything we know about the Colonial Marines says they were always ready for bear, and they were ready to fight. They're an all volunteer force in the age of impressment. They're all survivors of slavery who didn't have to volunteer to fight. They could have stayed on Tangier Island with the other black refugees and eventually been moved to freedom, but they didn't. They signed up, if you see what I mean. So yeah, I think that combination of all those societal fears and the actual presence of the Colonial Marines is what is a significantly bigger factor in cracking Bladensburg. And as I say, the Bladensburg army unzips, runs away, leaves Washington D.C. completely open to us. And the idea that what is often regarded as the United States' greatest military defeat was itself a symptom of the systematic weakness that was introduced into their society by chattel slavery, I think is an important observation, if you see what I mean, that deserves greater prominence.
If your theory is right, and it's a credible theory, there's a poetic justice to it, isn't there?
Mm-hmm.
Does this therefore mean that there are any Colonial Marines present at the burning of Washington?
Yes, indeed. This is an intriguing one. They definitely were. There's no suggestion. There's nowhere for them else to go, if you see what I mean, with the army. But they're intriguingly absent in American accounts of the burning of Washington in a way which I'd fully expect horrified, hyperbolic reports in American newspapers, either at the time or in other areas of this campaign later on, like things that they definitely didn't do, which were seen as shocking by Americans, were later attributed to them, if you see what I mean. So their absence in the burning of Washington is an intriguing one. They were definitely present, and there is an intriguing note that, as far as I can tell, there was only a relatively small number of Royal Marines who were kind of forming a bodyguard unit for Admiral Coburn. And then there was the Colonial Marines. But when the White House, as it is yet to be known, the President's Palace, as it was sometimes called, when that was burnt down, the firing party is explicitly referred to as Marines and sailors. So it isn't too great a jump of imagination to imagine that could have included some Colonial Marines, because again, they were quite well integrated with the Marines in many ways. But yeah, it's an intriguing absence in the story of Colonial Marines. Is they fought in the battle immediately before it. They were in the army that was burning the city, but they're invisible suddenly in everything about it.
To what extent, though, is that just you don't want to give people ideas? Do you know what I mean? Like, you've got this mass uprising, this mass emancipation movement. that then suddenly what goes and marches on your capital in a society that is built upon the slave labor of a particular ethnic group. You don't want what is fundamentally a success story for that ethnic group getting out. Now, the caveat to that would be, how do you control that information? How do you stop that from being spread? But nonetheless, I do wonder if that's what's at play there.
It's perfectly possible. Like, one of the problems with researching this subject in general is you're constantly fighting against the invisibility and the infantilizing of African American enslaved people, particularly in particularly in American writing. But you also, you can't, there's also infantilizing in British writing as well. Well, you see what I mean. But again, I suspect, yeah, we might have like ran into all those classic things where you've got a classic kind of societal omerta kind of situation where it's like, let's not, that was traumatic. Let's move past that and not talk about it. I mean, literally just before the Battle of Bladensburg, the Colonial Marines were augmented by more Colonial Marines who were recruited from farms liberated on the way to Bladensburg, if you see what I mean. So again, their presence is definitive and then suddenly invisible. I mean, like, one British officer's memoir about the operation does have as one intriguing sentence, which isn't about the Colonial Marines as such, but is about enslaved people in the Bladensburg area, where he says, after the American army falls back from Bladensburg and we advance and take the field, he runs into a group of enslaved people who, as he says in his book, our victory had now freed. And then it's again, it's just a really intriguing line. It says they then imitated for the British kind of bombastic and pompous announcements of victory that the Americans had did just before this battle, to the great amusement of the Brits, if you see what I mean. So so again, it's the idea that the Colonial Marines didn't take part in it, I think, it seems unlikely. But again, it is an intriguing one. I mean, in terms of propaganda, it could go either way. You could very easily argue that if the British had drawn attention to the destruction of Washington D.C. being partially the result of enslaved people rising in Europe, it would have been seen as this incredibly vicious, savage act against a fellow European ethnic group, a very European civilization, if you see what I mean. I mean, there is, again, to give you one final intriguing observation, there is a single piece of French propaganda that came out after the burning of Washington D.C., which is called something. It's called something like the March of Civilization, and it's literally a British officer, like a caricature of a British officer, like encouraging a very racialized image of a enslaved person in a military court, but not in trousers, just in a court, to throw a burning brand into like a classical edifice, which is handily labeled Washington, if you see what I mean. So that seems to suggest that at least to some people's eyes, the Colonial Marines were involved. But again, it is a piece of propaganda, so it's hard to say.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because if you give, I mean, there's so many ifs here, but if the Colonial Marines were involved in the burning and you give them the empowerment of acknowledgement of their actions, then that's, yes, it's a propaganda coup for those who want to turn around and say, look, the British are going and getting these, insert a whole bunch of racialized stereotypes here to go and do this work for them, and they are facilitating that. But also, Britain is a society that is cashing in on slave labor in the Caribbean and doesn't want to facilitate that empowerment of its black population, because then that will potentially embolden them. And the memory of Haiti is still very fresh. Let's not, forget that. Let's stay with this theme of attitudes. As these guys' combat experience grows, are British commanders acknowledging their contribution, either privately or
Yeah.
or perhaps publicly. I mean, there must be something going on for the French to pick up on this and start turning it into a caricature.
Yeah, that's an intriguing aspect of it. Privately, between the theatre commanders and so on, yeah, pretty much continuous fulsome praise. Whereas, again, you could perhaps suggest that part of that fulsome praise is itself an output of a kind of racist mindset. They're shocked at how good they are, if you see what I mean. But it appears sincere. And again, when you think of the composition of the unit, largely young men, all volunteers, all volunteers, they're if you put aside their race, they're a step above the average British soldier in terms of motivation and reason for being in uniform. So it's no surprise that they put the effort in so hard. The only negative about the Black refugees I've come across is a single private letter from a Royal Navy captain to his mum, oddly enough, which he writes back home. And it's not about the Colonial Marines themselves, it's about the Black refugees in general. He complains that the Black refugees on Tangier Island, some are working and doing things to the British, but most of them are just sitting idle. And he projects onto that, a classic stereotype of lazy and ungrateful Black people. But those people had been given a no strings attached offer of liberation by his commander in chief. So they were completely in the right. So I think he was just expressing a frustration at not being able to in my opinion, reading around it, he wasn't able to order these people to do military tasks as he might have wished. So he projects that stuff onto them. But all the other officers overwhelmingly positive, and we do bump against them. Admiral Cochrane was an inveterate schemer, and he loved a big plan. And so when he's writing back to London, he's very overt about how, we just need to keep arming people. We just need to keep arming enslaved people, and we've got the Americans cold. He also has an intriguing scheme idea, which doesn't go anywhere anyway. So it's a proper footnote, but it's a fun one, where he suggests overtly offering a big bounty to an enslaved person who comes to British forces with a horse that they can ride, with the intent of, and in the letter to London, he said, is straight on the nose. He said, I want to set up some Cossacks. I want an irregular cavalry-based formation that will terrorize the Americans. And it comes to nothing end. It just pops up kind of like this one time, I think, just because the numbers didn't add up in the end. But again, shows that his belief in the desire of the enslaved population to help an invader against their oppressors is just there, waiting to be used, waiting to be exploited. The only other interesting note I found about how the normal Brits, like the regular soldiers and Marines rather than officers, reacted to the Colonial Marines is there was definitely at least one incident where an American slave owner coming to British forces, again under flag of truce, encountered not one of his formerly enslaved, but someone he knew, just passed out drunk with a load of other British soldiers because they were off duty. And he was really upset. He was really disturbed by this, but they were doing nothing wrong. They weren't at work, if you know what I mean. And so this feels like there was a good relationship there. And there's also another, again, from an American slave owner, where he perhaps lies to himself a little bit. He writes in his report that when he visited the British under flag of truce, he spoke to some enslaved people who formerly belonged to him, and he was convinced that he was talking them round into coming home, until a Royal Marine who was on sentry duty on deck, came out with something like, this rascal's going to hang you the second he gets you back. What nonsense, if you know what I mean. Like the Americans, outrageous. I would never hang, a unit of production. But again, that suggests the relationship between the common soldiery, so to speak, and the formerly enslaved people was perhaps a bit more a bit more cordial than might immediately come to mind. And again, I look at the wider context of British society at this point. Once you get below a certain point, although there is the arbitrary distinction of skin color, once you get below a certain point in British society, you're all just subjects. There's differentiations of that, but but you're all kind of just living in the command and control world of other people, if you know what I mean. So I don't think there was I don't think there was necessarily. I mean, again, you can get quite poetic about it. I mean, you could very easily imagine some burglar from Preston who got joined the army or prison, and now he's here liberating enslaved people who had no choice in their life, if you know what I mean. You can get very sentimentalist about what that must have been like for people.
Yeah, I mean, I keep sort of trying to think what the precedent would be from India if there was any precedent. And my gut is that the army tries to keep the fundamentally its white troops and its sepoys separate, whether that's keeping regular King's army troops in barracks or whether it's the European regiments that they raise. My sense is that they try and sort of enforce a form of segregation effectively. So it's interesting to hear that I'll be curious to know if there was any sort of comeback. This is something we can't ever know, but if there was some kind of comeback for the white soldiers who were then drinking with a member of the Colonial Marines. Can I also just take a moment to marvel at the idea of a Corps of Colonial Cossacks? Yeah, that's a book that needed writing, but sadly we'll never see. Starting to think about the fallout from all of this. How did the Marines themselves, I mean, can we even know this, I guess is an important question, but how did the Marines themselves feel about what they've done here? The fact that they have taken this opportunity, self-emancipated, then used that as a kind of positive multiplier effect to go and liberate friends and family members on those plantations, and then have formed this unit and gone on to stick it to the society that has enslaved them, and then potentially take part, if not sit back and watch, as the capital of that society literally burns because of, in part, what they've done. Do we have any sense of their reaction to that?
Only in very vague terms. The best examples of like trying to piece this together I can think of is I've mentioned before that post-war, quite a number of colonial marines, particularly those who were NCOs, end up as kind of community leaders in the various communities they found across the British Atlantic Caribbean world, and they definitely exhibit a sense of you us, we're entitled to something now, which is very often like negatively referenced by future British authorities. They're so they're so demanding, if you see what I mean. But again, within the context of the world that these people inhabit, the idea that they felt that actually no, there's a lot. I can draw a line in the sand here and say you British authority, whatever you might be, colonial in Nova Scotia, Trinidad, whatever, Bermuda as well. Our relationship with you has this contractual quality where we've done something and you owe us. That itself, I think, is incredibly emblematic. It hints at what the community that was formed, the communities that were formed, felt about who they were now. Now, they definitely moved from being, figures in the landscape to masters of their own fate, overtly, and we're gripping that. John Weiss, who's very much my precursor in this area, he makes an interesting observation that post-war, when the Colonial Marines were still a military unit under military discipline, or in Bermuda on Island, there was a point where they went on strike. They refused to do any duties, and that seems to have been part of the negotiation between the negotiation between them and the authorities about the employment of their wider families in the various military services on Island, and their future, like what was going to happen to them now that the war was over. And again, that was respected. There's, I've found no evidence of like, the classic kind of like, we'll round up some ringleaders, punish them, we'll give a, we'll actually concede the point, but we will exemplarily punish some people because this is still a military discipline situation. There's no indication that that happened. And indeed, while the war was still going on, some of the black refugees who were already sent to Bermuda while the war was still going on, again, mainly civilians, they were given jobs in the Royal Navy dockyard on Island, doing various things like women and children, like caulking boards, caulking decks, and things like this. And at one point they either made some kind of protest or went on strike for better pay. So these are people who were previously enslaved, not only now getting paid work, but saying, actually, my paid work's worth more than that. And again, the governor of, I think it was either the governor of Bermuda or the military garrison guy in charge of Island, like wrote to Coburn and said, you got to stop sending these people because this is becoming unmanageable. And he wrote back an incredibly kind of like, don't harsh my vibe kind of letter saying, you should be happy that you are liberating people. You're part of the process of liberating people. Pay them, if you know what I mean. Which again is really, really, and Coburn, of course, was, when he was, he wrote overtly in one of his letters, as I mentioned before, that he initially thought this wasn't a good idea. Enslaved people can't fight, and now he's overtly advocating for them on a level that's way higher. And I mean, perhaps we could suggest that because this was such a theatre focused thing, this only happened in the Chesapeake Bay and North Florida, which we'll talk about at a later point. But these two theatres, at the end of the day, they're sideshows of a sideshow, because the War of 1812 is a sideshow to the Napoleonic Wars. The main War of 1812 is the Great Lakes and the Canadian border. So I think it created this little pocket universe, if you know what I mean, where the rules disappeared quite a bit. And as you say, maybe when it moved further up the chain, particularly in the post-war world, there might have been a bit of embarrassment about that. I can think of one good example, I think, of that from the Florida thing, but we'll have to talk about that another time. But yeah, there was certainly a suggestion that, I can certainly say there was probably at least a little suggestion that post-war there was a bit of a, well, in some ways perhaps we went too far in terms of upsetting this kind of racialized understanding of the world. But in theatre at the time, it looks, it's quite bizarre reading it in your 21st century context to watch all these quite staid Regency men momentarily, in many ways, become like moral crusaders. I mean, what at least one British officer did kind of hint that liberating enslaved people is what kept a lot of the troops in the game, because just setting fire to stuff was kind of depressing terror tactics. And because the Americans are they're essentially still British in voice, in culture, many were born in Britain, but it feels like we're terrorizing our own people. That's actually quite a morale downer. But if we're liberating enslaved people, that's something we want to be doing, if you see what I mean.
Do we know if Coburn retained this interest in emancipation after the campaign was over?
And not directly, as best I can tell. He just he continued being a senior naval officer. But intriguingly, his brother, I think was George. He ended up as governor of Bermuda not long after. And at one point, as governor of Bermuda, an American delegation came as part of American efforts to reclaim enslaved people who we'd taken away during the War of 1812. And the American wrote back to the president. I don't think it was John Quincy Adams. It was someone else quite big, if you know what I mean, in American history. But he literally wrote back to the president. It says, I had an interview with the governor and it stated that I wanted to be allowed to speak to these people and try and bring them back to their homes. And Coburn said he would rather the whole island sink than give up one person. Which again, so suggests there was a bit of there was certainly a mutuality of feeling there.
They've certainly corresponded, haven't they, in order to formulate that opinion. Okay, well, you've alluded to it there. What happens to the Marines post-conflict?
The vast majority of the black refugees get moved to Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and it would be fair to say they suffer from a kind of mix of indifference and neglect in Nova Scotia from the colonial authorities. And one colonial governor of Nova Scotia, more or less overtly, tries to move this new black population into kind of a seasonal lower class labor force. So like in summer when the dock's in full flow and all this, we'll have all these guys standing around waiting for work, and we'll try and keep them in that kind of tenuous state. So we've constantly got this supply of labor there. But intriguingly, that indifference and neglect is continually contested by black refugee communities, which include lots of now demobilized colonial Marines. William Deere, who you might remember from the one who got given permission to go and rescue his wife Nancy, and later opened a pub in Halifax. He was quite big. He was quite big in this. He appears in all kinds as a counter signatory in lots of people's petitions. He and another colonial Marine started a still existing black Baptist church group, which still exists in Nova Scotia today. So they're building a community against this indifference. But intriguingly, at one point, the Earl Bathurst in London, the Secretary of State from the colonies, he writes to the governor of Nova Scotia and reminds him that the British government made explicit promises of support to these people, and you have to get on with that. Which again, I think a quite incredible kind of central government intervention in a colonial matter, if you know what I mean. And particularly to again, assert this British debt of honour to a people who are part of an ethnic group that we are still enslaving in other colonies, if you see what I mean. So it's that shows there was definitely a sensation of contractualness between government and the black refugees. But for the colonial Marines themselves, those who remained in the unit at the end of the war, because there seems to have been pretty much continuous churn. People were constantly joining, but it also appears that people were constantly leaving, and there doesn't appear to be much kind of attempts to limit that. So people were constantly appearing in the list, then disappearing within a couple of months, but they're in Halifax with their family, if you see what I mean. So it's again, that's intriguing itself. In the West Indies regiments, of course, at this time, if you joined up, you were in for life, for example, if you see what I mean. But those who remained at the end of the war, they were moved to Island in Bermuda, and they were maintained as a unit. But again, intriguingly, you have at this point, it was the 6 companies of colonial Marines, which included some from the Florida theatre who were moved to them. But alongside them, you also had their wider families. And that's not an unofficial thing. That's an official kind of link up. They're constantly listed together and organized by the British authorities as one group. Intriguingly, it isn't just like wives and kids. Like one guy has his parents, like in the civilian group, coming with the army, coming with the unit. And also at this point, the unit, I think, possibly because we're now at peacetime, it gets some of the accoutrements of a military unit hadn't yet had time to do. So at this point, like a very young lad, I think about 13 or 14, suddenly appears as a musician, where previously that had never kind of been mentioned, if you see what I mean. So it feels like they were being formalized, in the fashion of a Royal Marines battalion. But as we get into 1816, my feeling is that they were maintained in case War of America kicked off again in the immediate post-war aftermath, when we were really hammering out lots of treaties, trying to demilitarize the Great Lakes. We wouldn't have a silly naval arms race there ever again, all this kind of stuff. If any of that had went wrong, I suspect the Colonial Marines would have been at the spear point of a return punitive expedition to bring pressure on the Americans again. Yeah. But in mid-1816, that ship has sailed, and the military establishment's been wound down in general because Napoleon's out of the picture as well. It's an era of peace, and so the colonial marines on Bermuda are demobilized as one group to the island of Trinidad, and the choice of Trinidad is intriguing. I think the major reason it was Trinidad is because Trinidad was a relatively newly occupied British colony, having previously been Spanish. And Trinidad, although it was a slave colony, so those plantations, Trinidad did not have like a House of Representatives or a landowners like advisory group working with the British governor. Barbados, Jamaica had quasi-democratic systems which were inevitably dominated by the landholding, slaveholding class. Trinidad doesn't have that. Trinidad just has a single, essentially military dictator. So he can just snap his fingers and say, this is what we're doing. And he gets representations from the slave owner community of Trinidad, which is largely Spanish, so there are already Brits and some French. And he brushes them off and says, no, I'm more than happy to bring this group of military trained free black people to our slave colony, despite what you say. And he makes a very salient point that some of the slave owners who are actually saying this is a bad idea are themselves mixed race slave owners again, which is kind of a legacy from the Spanish period. So he says, that by that logic, why do I trust you? But he makes the intriguing, I think, very British point that when these people get here, we're going to set them all up as free farmers with land, and that means that in the event of an uprising, a revolutionary uprising by enslaved people, they've got as much to lose as you, because they're also landowners. So they'll come out in the defense of the state, which I think shows a very intriguing kind of like colorblind understanding of what revolutions are about, if you see what I mean. Revolutions, it's all about destroying the state, redistributing property and all that. So anyone who has an interest in the pre-existing society will naturally be on the defensive side, if you see what I mean. Which again is intriguing. It's hard to imagine it's hard now to imagine having a mindset like that in some ways, because we live in such a much more all this kind of history is much more heavily racially divided now, if you see what I mean. But the Colonial Marines do arrive. Some numbers of them settle in the region around Port of Spain, which is the capital of Trinidad today, and they kind of then amalgamate into the population around that area. But the vast majority of the Colonial Marines, they're put into essentially a virgin area of the island, north of the town of Moruga. There's the main road is called Indian Walk, harking back to Trinidad's indigenous population who lived in that region. And the Colonial Marines are given individual family plots of land organized quite charmingly by company. So first company gets a section with all subdivided, second company and so on. And the vast majority of those communities still exist today, and they're still called third company, fourth company, and so on. The village of fourth company and so on, and things like that. And the way these communities are organized is, again, overtly militarized, in my opinion. The NCOs, the sergeants and corporals, become like constables of their associate community. So the discipline and structure of the military unit immediately transfers to the new communities they build. But again, there's an indication. There's a very strong indication of their agency. There's an area, I think, near now the modern town of Third Company, and it's called Hard Bargain, and that was an area of land that was originally allocated, and when the Colonial Marines arrived, it turned out to be really bad land, and there was no way the surveyors could have known that, because it's entirely virgin land in the middle of nowhere. But it was like, no, this is bad. This is very crappy land for farming. So a couple of miles away, we now have, I think it's still called, this is a village, we now have it's called New Claim or something like that, which is where this unit was then moved to by the colonial authorities because because we owe them good land, if you see what I mean. So that's an intriguing point. And while in Canada, in Nova Scotia particularly, the Black refugee community was kind of engaged in this constant cycle of asking for more support to get off the ground. Really. In Trinidad, the support was constantly there. A white magistrate was given essentially a distribution task of, tools, food rations, and equipment for, I think, maybe the first 2 or so years, so into like 1818, to get them up and running. And once the community was up and running, that support was taken away. But it wasn't until the community was up and running, if you see what I mean. And it was many years before the land claims became formally linked to the individuals, which is an intriguing element there. They had these lands, but it seems to have been very much kind of considered kind of a legal gift from the British state, which was still which ownership of which was still retained, or like again, the legal ownership was still retained. Day-to-day use of the land was the Colonial Marines, but eventually they became the full owners of their land, which was fortunate because many years later, oil was discovered in that part of Trinidad, creating a little boom for that community. But where this community was meant it was isolated and insular from the the rest of the slave society of the island in many ways. So they coalesced as an ethnic group, which is still recognized today in Trinidad, who are now called the Americans, which is the portmanteau of the Americans, because they were American. And one aspect of the one comparator to this, I'd sometimes jump to is this is remarkably reminiscent to what happened to the Maroons of Jamaica, who were a pre-existing free black community when England and later Britain took over Jamaica, and there was various attempts to bring them heel, which didn't work, and it all ended with them being given, with them being explicitly recognised as like a free enclave in Jamaica, which had the requirement that in the event of a slave uprising by the enslaved Afro-Caribbean people, the Maroons would come to British aid, which they did frequently over the following centuries. That mirrors the suggestion of the Trinidadian governor about this is the role the Americans, or as they would become, the Americans will play in the future. That never came to pass in Trinidadian history. There was never an opportunity to test that, but it's an intriguing one. And I say the community represents in many ways this unique flowering of what early African American culture could have been if slavery wasn't in the picture. So that you've got a Baptist religion. You've got cultural practices which include kind of hangover elements of West African mysticism plus Christianity, of course. And intriguingly, at least in the early years, the seeming presence of some Islamic practices, which is partially because lots of slaves, particularly in the American South, were from the parts of like what is now northern Nigeria, which was Muslim. I mean, again, if you ever want incendiary point, I think possibly the first mosques in America were on slave plantations. That's all those weird facts that no one seems to want to put a pin on that. Everyone talks about the first civilian mosque, which I think was in the 20th century, but there's definitely you can visit plantations which are now museums in places like Georgia, and there's a mosque in the slave part of the plantation. But that Islamic practices eventually just seem to have been subsumed into the Christianized ones. But it's intriguing observation. There was also a need for a bit of social engineering by the British authorities. This community was overwhelmingly male, so there was at least one, and there might have been two off the top of my head, times where the Royal Navy intercepted slave ships, and instead of sending the enslaved people to Sierra Leone, or I think Ascension Island was the other place we tended to send people, the women of these ships were sent to Trinidad, to the American community to balance the sex ratio. ratio, which is again, it creates a very peculiar, like there's a great book called like the Atlas of the Slave Trade, which is an incredible data set with all beautiful maps and movements of numbers and people, and there's like a couple of times when Trinidad has these random little inputs of 100 people, just completely untethered from everything else going on, and that's what that was. It was the introduction of more women to this community. And again, they just then seem to have went on to a very kind of like frontier life in many ways. Whereas, I mean, the only tragedy I can find that seems to have struck this community was there seems to have been a point where one former colonial marine murdered another and his family in, say, 1820 or something like that, which I think must have been, again, an insular community of all the people who've been through all this together. That must have been an incredibly traumatic experience for the community isolated as they were. But overall, in 2016, the Trinidadian government celebrated 200 years of the American community, and the Trinidadian Ministry of Culture and put on an exhibition about their history, which was called Salvation Through War, which I think kind of captures how the community even today remembers itself. I watched one interview relatively recently with an American gentleman who the language he used was actually deliciously American. He said, we fought for our independence and gained it, if you see what I mean. And I say, although they were now, British subjects on a British island, they were essentially almost entirely free in this frontier life in central Trinidad. And it's hard to truly kind of quantify what that must have felt like over the following decades for people to just, or imagine trying to explain to your freeborn children what led to you living this life in the forests of central Trinidad, if you know what I mean, what it means, particularly when British slavery was still ongoing for 20 years, if you see what I mean. It's genuinely quite powerful. As a final kind of peculiar historical moment, in about 2010 or something like that, there was a group in the US state of Georgia who were looking into African American cooking practices, of all things, and they discovered that in Trinidad, in the American communities, they're still growing a particular breed of rice that has long since died out in the United States, which is a crucial element in historic African American food from that region, which was thought lost forever. But this community was still growing it and still doing it in the way of their ancestors 200 years ago, without the influence of slavery diluting that, if you see what I mean. So again, I think they're a time capsule and a kind of an alternate world view, if you see what I mean, which again, as a historian, is magical.
Matt, as ever, your enthusiasm is utterly infectious. Folks, you've been listening to Matthew Taylor, the author of Black Redcoats, the Corps of Colonial Marines, 1814 to 1816. It's available from Pen and Sword's website, and we will put a link on in the description. Matt, it is always such a joy to talk to you. I know we are having some discussions about other topics that you're going to be joining us for in the not too distant future, but we will save that for another time. Folks, there will be an omnibus episode off the back of this in a few months. So if you haven't listened to parts 1 and 2 and are too lazy to scroll back through the back catalogue to hear those installments, then we will do the hard work for you and make sure there is an omnibus. As ever, you can catch that first on our Patreon page. But for now, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. We will be back very soon. What did you think of this episode? If you're listening on Spotify, you can now post your comments and questions, and we'll get back to you. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much, much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in late March 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier: Brendan Teeling, Beatrice DeGraff, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Ian Harding, Anonymous American, James Flewick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Darla Vincent, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlem, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, and Wojciech Stefanovic. The Admirals: John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, and Tim Pritchard. The Chiefs of Staff, that's Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion de Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and Duke of Wellington Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, Josh and Zoe, take care of yourselves, folks, stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.